Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. So today I'm doing a healing journey on behalf of a group of people that really hits my sweet spot of applying traditional shamanism to modern problems and challenges. So the offering is Dismantle credit card debt, and I'm going to go in and work on behalf of the group of people who signed up. But I wanted to share a kind of a do-it-yourself manual because I really, when I'm doing this kind of intricate work, there's a limited number of people I can do it for because there is some complexity, and it may or may not be in your budget. If you're really strapped for cash and you need that money for food, it would be good to spend it that way. And one of the trade-offs that sometimes people have is more time on their hands, but less available money. And I really believe that this is something that if you feel called, you can absolutely do on your own behalf. And if you're like, yeah, that's great, but I don't feel all that inclined, you can also have someone like me do it. I have a overall money cultivation offer where I just work on behalf of a group of people. It's specifically for people who've done a soul retrieval with me to move their money outcomes in their favor, to clear away old patterning and limiting beliefs and trauma, and juice up the law of attraction and vibration and assimilation and all kinds of different things. Because what I found, having a lot of years with a lot of credit card debt and a lot of stress and a lot of struggle and a lot of feeling like every time I brought in enough money, there was a new bill, or my electricity went up, or they moved the finish line in some way, and just a really chronic experience about being okay enough. I wasn't ever like, oh, how am I going to feed myself, or how am I going to pay my rent? But I was watching credit card debt increase. I ended up with quite a lot of it as I figured out how to be sustainable as an entrepreneur. And I just had this chronic emotional feeling about money and low-level stress and worry and fretting on a rumination loop is not exactly what we're going for with law of attraction, vibration, and assimilation to work with energetic principles for money to be corrected. And I would use shamanic work. I would be short or be behind, or business would slow down, and I would go in and work with principles that are very much in integrity. I always do highest and best good. Let's be in the flow with right alignment. So it wasn't ever a manipulation, but I would do some work when the money stress escalated. But then I would find that over time, it was still kind of back to the chronic state of stress and anxiety. And I didn't much enjoy doing proactive money work because of how much emotion there was. So in order to think about doing a shamanic journey, I would need to think about, oh wow, I have a lot of emotional debt around this. I have a lot of stress. I have a lot of fear, which the brain, kind of wants to shy away from. So when I was doing journey work on my own behalf, unless I was trying to resolve an acute situation, I tended not to engage as much. And at the worst of it, I was living in a granny flat under a house that was owned by a woman who had a domestically violent boyfriend who was on meth. And I never felt unsafe with him. He was never dangerous to me, but I spent more nights than I like to remember listening to whether it was just an ugly fight or if he was actually being violent with her, and gosh darn it, I should call 911, and navigating the complexity of, well, if I interfere too much for what I think is a good idea, I don't want to give up the security of this place. Because based on the fact that there was a meth addict who was periodically getting carried off by the police for various bad behavior, my rent never went up. And I was really in the midst of this struggle of every year seeing my credit card debt go up, of trying to do everything I could. I was so in love with this shamanic work, but I was way better at shamanic work than I was at entrepreneurship, of managing money. It was a big aha when I applied for a particular deferment where I could make interest only payments. And they said, yeah, absolutely, no problem. But you have to go through this financial training, which I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And it was just on the phone with an hour for someone, and he taught me as an entrepreneur about adding up all of the one time throughout the year expenses. So my tax payments, my property insurance, my renter's insurance, all these things that were non-reoccurring, that I would just keep getting hit with these bills. Make a whole list, add up the number, and then put that amount of money aside every month, which really obvious. No one ever taught me that. No one ever suggested it. And there are these funny taboos about talking about money, which got in the way of just some real 101 skills where, things got a lot better when I understood where the finish line is. Because if you're somebody who's been in a situation of needing to kind of watch, maybe not every penny, but every dollar or every $10, and kind of stress about the tension every time you want to buy yourself a treat. There's the tension of the big credit cards that feel insurmountable. And at the point that you maybe have a little bit of extra influx, it's really nice to swing the pendulum, because it's been so much on the side of economy and, deal with the basics, that we tend to want to, indulge in some things. But I was spending money that actually I needed for the system as a whole. So I'm a huge fan of this notion of money as a learnable skill, and recognizing that we just don't get the kind of education that we could, and the Dunning-Kruger effect, where your brain lies to you and tells you know everything you need to know about a subject that you actually know almost nothing about, can further get in the way of us saying, I wonder what insight someone could have. And we're not talking about the financial investors that will help you plan retirement, because those are great too. But, there are courses and people, and probably free things on YouTube that are giving quality education of the nuts and bolts of adulting with money. But going back to that situation, I finally ended up having to move because the situation deteriorated still further beyond what I could rationalize, because I was paying so much under market value for my rent in that place with the meth addict on the property. And I rationalized, well, if I moved into an apartment, I wouldn't have this beautiful outdoor space with my hot tub. I'd be paying the same or even more. And who knows if the neighbors would be fighting through the walls. So I could just have a worse place to live in exactly the same thing, instead of getting resourceful and starting to look, because, there was just so much contraction around, I am really afraid of not having enough money. I'm really feeling like I'm doing everything I know how to do and not getting to the finish line. And the stress of that, got in the way of my being resourceful. Eventually, the situation escalated. I hit my limit. I moved out. I was like, I have got to make it work. I can't stay here. So the amount of rent that I was paying a year later was half again what I'd been paying in that place, or even a little more, because utilities were no longer included. And yet my financial situation got a lot better. So, obviously the stress of, just having a ton of rose quartz and obsidian and trying to live with that situation wasn't doing me any particular favors. But one of the really key things that changed is I got incredibly systematic about doing energetic work on my own behalf. I could really see the pattern of how chronically throughout my life, because my parents, while they provided really well for us and really effectively, they were just always so stressed about money. They were stretching dollars like nobody's business to create the life that they wanted to have for us. And so there was this sort of smoke or flavor to the household that was stress and anxiety about money. My mom described her definition of wealth being her stomach not hurting when she paid the bills. So sensitive little Katie grew up with this, background energy and experience, and then duplicated it in my own life of being fundamentally okay, but chronically stressed and afraid and anxious about money. So what changed after I moved and needed to, get to where I was dealing with things and still having this huge pile of credit card debt was a decision to be really systematic, like not just do journey work to bring in money for the moment, but to say, wow, I'm so good at shamanic work, and yet I don't systematically leverage that ability to just be really consistent working with this. And so what I want to offer, one of the things I want to offer is that if you're in an acute money place and you do a big manifestation ritual, that's great. It may move some energy. But having a practice where week in and week out, you're systematically working with a method of magic that's completely in integrity. You have to be careful. There's a whole lot of money manifestation magic out there that is really unethical. It's going to create a lot of backlash. This is with the integrity of good ethics. You're working on this. And one of the aspects that I started working on systematically was this dismantling of credit card debt. So it occurred to me that as a shamanic practitioner, I believe that everything has life and structure and energy and wisdom, and that you can interact with that. And I certainly was doing that with rocks and trees and streams and Death Valley as a whole. I was talking to ancient standing stone circles when I, figured out ways to travel internationally. There was a lot of applying this in the normal way of being in relationship and interaction with things in the physical world. But for some reason, I didn't clue into the fact that there was this energetic structure created partly by just the nature of credit card debt and then strewn with all of my emotional thoughts about it and all of the energy I put on it. And I went, wow, I could just take down that structure. At the level of fact, it will still say in this electronic world that we all invest in, it's not even talking about physical things. There's just a number in this place as this line of information that we all agree on that I owe X amount of money. And there's still this huge energetic structure in my field about what meaning I've made of that, because there are lots of things that are in my field, like the fact that I have a car that I just don't make that much meaning of. I've been blessed and fortunate to just have a car, since I was 16. They're not necessarily fancy cars, but they meet my needs and I am glad of them. And there isn't a huge energetic structure around a vehicle. It's something I'm just present with. I tend, and it blesses my life in some really cool ways. But this credit card thing, I had strewn all this energy on it and made this big structure. And by systematically taking apart this structure over and over and over again, it made it harder to sustain in the physical world. And it took a couple of years, but once I started working on it in that way, it wasn't that long before I zeroed out my credit card debt. And sometimes there's something that I commit to, like, hey, I really want to join this mastermind. I don't have quite the cash flow, but my ability to just keep taking down that structure tends to produce a result that when I purposely and thoughtfully put something on a credit card, I'm paying it off a lot sooner rather than later. And I'm just leveraging the fact that I am really good with energy, and I would argue that we can all be really good with energy with intention and focus. And a lot of the intention and focus I see is the kind of magical thinking of a lottery win, which is a really big energetic difference from where you might be. So watching what the numbers tell us, most people who have these big lottery wins end up in as bad or worse of a condition financially as they did before they had the big lottery win. It seems like we would have, unlimited wealth and that would set us for life. That's the dream and the fantasy and the longing. but that's not what actually plays out. And psychologists would talk about, all different things. As a shamanic practitioner, I'm saying, yeah, they rocked the law of attraction. They drew this money to them, but they weren't sustaining the law of assimilation. So it just couldn't stay with them. The energetic principle wasn't there. And as a result, the money came, but then it went away. And what I would offer is, hey, we can change our outcomes, especially if we're looking to move them with modest, consistent steps rather than the kind of magical thinking of, I'll do one big ritual and all my money woes will be solved. So this probably isn't the best podcast for the person who's, really invested in the dream that if they just rock law of attraction well enough, they'll win the lottery, and then they won't ever have to have limitations on how they spend money for the rest of their lives. Even people who have a ton of money, you see this with people who make these huge salaries. A lot of times they blow through them very quickly. It's a interesting thing. But for this work, what I did is often when I want something, I want it for the people in my life as well. And so what I realized was, okay, I am going to make sure that I systematically work on my money results every week. I want to do one journey a week that works on moving the dial of this. And if I invite other people along and I do a journey a week on their behalf, it'll be more fun. It's maybe not the best thing to admit, but there's just something that lights up my heart about doing shamanic work on behalf of others and doing the things that I know are good for me, and just, not as compelling in the same way. So I knew if I promised other people, I would do it for sure. And I could take everyone else along because I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful if you do something every week to work on this. So one of the things that you could do, there are many things. I'm going to give you one, which is fire ceremony. It's a very specific fire ceremony. You'll find it on the articles page of my website at handsoverheart.com, which is under the resources tab. And it's a very specific fire ceremony where you can put credit card debt or student loan debt or other kinds of debt that are having an emotional and psychological weight into the fire. And you can invite in having, I recommend, enough money and then some as a really potent place where it's not this pie in the sky. There's a thing about trying to go from, absolutely broke to a multimillionaire that it just requires so much energy. And in a way, we almost have to work so much harder than we need to. And science tells us that our brains lie to us, and there's actually, after we get to enough and then some, which is a different number for every person and in different societies and places with cost of living. But once we get to that enough and then some, there's no correlation between more money and more happiness. It doesn't correlate. Now, if you're below the poverty line and you get to enough and then some, for sure your happiness will go up. It is very, very good thing for your happiness not to be under financial stress. Very, very helpful. But beyond that, it's not as helpful. And the amount of energy that needs moving to change your results isn't as great if you're not going for something that only a very small fraction of the population has happen in their lives. So I'm sorry if I'm bursting a bubble here. I know there are people who are really attached to the idea that they could just find the secret of magic that would grant them unlimited wealth and never having to, deny an impulse for buying something. And I get that. I get that that's a fun fantasy and dream. But what I want to offer is that if you're doing fire ceremonies systematically to release credit card debt, the fire will work on your behalf to take apart the energetic structure. You can also do it daily if you're like, yep, I'm ready to go. Once a week sounds a little spaced out. You can do it daily for 21 days. You can then shift over to doing a maintenance schedule where you do it a couple of times a week. And you can invite in a way that's for the highest and best good of all concerned. May money flow to me? May I have enough and then some, and you're repatterning your field. And the same principle that applies to those lottery winners who ended up in worse financial conditions, they had at the level of fact a ton of money, and at the level of energetics a structure that disagreed with that, which meant that the physical world moved into alignment with what was true in their energy body. What you're making true in your energy body is a dismantling of the structure of credit card debt or other kinds of debt, of lack, of fear. You're clearing all of that out, and you're putting in over and over and over again the blueprint of what you really do want. And by strengthening your energy body, and there are lots of other ways you can tend this. I like having a money altar. If you want to hear me geek out on this way more, I have a money mastery program for modern times in my academy. So you can hear me go really systematically through all the ways that I think we can work very adeptly with the energy of money to shift our results. But that's a much more comprehensive program. So for now, I just invite you to consider that if your energy body is cleared of the structure of credit card debt, which you can do with intention and focus and the structure of the fire ceremony, among other ways, but I'm giving you this one for the sake of simplicity. You could also do it with shamanic journey work. If you're a practitioner, you could go directly in and say, hey guides, help me take apart this credit card structure. Then the credit cards have a much harder time being sustained in your field. And after fighting with it for well over a decade, I saw it shift very, very quickly when I got super consistent with working on my results. And I don't know, 3 or 4 years in of just not having chronic money stress. I occasionally revisit it. It comes up if I've, committed more money to travel, so the savings has dropped a little bit, or I know I'll have something on credit cards temporarily. Sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, I'm playing my greatest hits of, focusing on numbers instead of flow. Okay, a little more attention. But going through and working with this systematically is so helpful. And just know that there's a part of you that will want to avoid it if you're in an acute money situation, because when we get present with our pain points, a lot of the emotion we've been numbing about the pain point comes up to be dealt with. And it is hard to sit with your vulnerability or your fear. I mean, if I'd really sat down and fully looked at what it was costing me to have this story, and I had people giving me feedback, it's just that the people who know and love me know that Katie Weatherup is a very stubborn, determined person, and until it's her idea, she's probably not going to make a move. So I certainly had people who I think were like, oh, I don't love that you're living in this situation. But until it escalated and kind of the house of cards fell down, it stayed in place. But there were a lot of prices to doing it that way. I had to move really fast because of how unstable the situation was. And, I was like, okay, I'll move me and my cat out, and then I'll come back and I'll pack. And I came home and the door was unlocked and I did not leave it unlocked. And so, I totally stepped up the timeline of like, okay, it could be messy, but let's get all my stuff out because I don't want anything to go missing. It was expensive and very stressful, which if I'd gotten present with it sooner, I'm using the example because I think it applies, where I'd gone, wow, this isn't really a good situation. I don't think it's going to get better. And instead of looking at the rental offerings one time and not immediately seeing the perfect thing and throwing up my hands and saying, well, I'm just going to double down, I had just taken, 15 minutes a day to just keep pulling up other places I could live and going and meeting people and putting in applications. I could have moved out far more gracefully, far sooner. And I give myself grace that I was where I was and I had the stories I did, and I tend to, really, really like to put my roots in the ground. But as it turned out in the fullness of time, I live in a place that I love now. It's the happiest I've ever been in any place that I've ever lived. And there's so much that is a gift of getting to live in a really aligned home, especially since my practice has shifted to 100% distance. I do all my work over the phone and over Skype and online. So I'm very connected to my home, and I'm here a great deal of the time. So whether you're thinking about credit card debt or something else, there just may be something that's really persistent in your life, and you do kind of the heroic effort to move it, and then it moves maybe a little bit or it doesn't, and then you give up. Think about that systematic work, especially as applied to magic, intention, focus, energy work. If you do shamanic journey, consistently journeying to the guides to talk to them about the situation and get help and support and new layers and insights. I work with a lot of really capable, resourceful people, and if they haven't moved something on their own, it probably means that there are 5 or 6 different anchor points or complexities that need to be worked through before the energy moves enough to shift it. There's probably a level of complexity, and that's one of the areas that I really excel, is people who are really capable and skillful, but something just has a lot of layers, and some of them are obscured or blinded to them. So for those of you who've done a soul retrieval with me who are listening, I think a soul retrieval is wonderful in its own right. Like, I wish everyone would have a soul retrieval so they could just get that foundation of their energy back. So if that is in your budget and you would like to say, yeah, systematic work on money outcomes is great, let me just hire Katie to handle that. I've always wished I could pay someone to exercise for me, which isn't available, but you can certainly pay me a very reasonable amount of money, at least in my estimation. I feel like it's kind of a way that I tend and take care of and mama bear and spoil the people who, are in my sphere of concern. So I've made it a very affordable offer comparatively to just work really systematically on your behalf, because I'm doing it for myself anyway. So I want to help you guys all out if that's in alignment. And if it's not in your budget to have a soul retrieval, or you don't feel called for whatever reason, please take the wisdom of working on this systematically so that you can move some things. And there's no prerequisite to my $25 offers, at least that's the price they are as of recording this podcast, like the one I'm doing today that is Dismantle credit card debt. So you have the option of having me periodically work on it. But regardless, I just really saw different results treating the notion that I could set the energy around my money outcomes, where I dismantled the things I didn't want and created structure for the things that I did, and tended that very consistently and very systematically. For gardeners out there, I'm not much of a gardener, but if you are, you really know that. I was the kid who, would get inspired to make a garden and do all the work of preparing the soil and dragging up the, manure from the goat shed that had sat there for a couple of years, this deep, rich dirt that we had amid all the kind of rocky clay dirt, where I grew up. And I'd plant all the seeds and I'd get everything perfect. And then I wouldn't water it or weed it because I was a big project person instead of a sustained effort. And for those of you who are gardeners, you tend regularly in small doses, and sometimes they're bigger projects. But I would really like to illuminate this concept that much as we could interact with the things that we find in nature, we can interact with the systems of money that are the co-creations of humans and structures of credit card debt, and work with those thoughtfully in a way that moves them within our field, that then informs our results. And it'll be a lot less uphill. You still have to take right action in the everyday world, but there's so much less effort that goes in when you move it from an energetic place and then you move it from an action place. And so I hope that this is supportive if you're somebody who's struggling with debt. I really know how helpless that can feel, and I really appreciate the relief of not having that kind of mental and psychological and emotional burden that I was carrying. And so if this gives you some insight that would help that shift for you, that would make me so happy on your behalf. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.